So just by way of introductory remarks, clearly we're going to be focusing on this first session on the US and European dialogue. Personally, I come at this from a derivatives industry perspective. Dodd-Frank on the one hand in the US and a combination of regulations in Europe, be it EMIR or MiFID II, MiFIR, among others. The rules have typically, as you know, started out from a common place, G20 commitments in Pittsburgh in 2009 being the most obvious of them. We also, of course, see bodies like CPSS IOSCO promulgating their principles for financial market infrastructures, and to a greater or lesser extent, those being used for some of the cross-border dialogue. And the Basel Committee with Basel III, again, seeing slightly different take by the Europeans in CRD4 on some of the cross-border and bases for recognition, focusing in particular on are the rules equivalent to EMIR rather than do the rules of foreign non-European jurisdictions meet the IOSCO principles for financial market infrastructures. We have seen, of course, development of regulation at different speeds around the globe. The US going first. One of the benefits, if I can put it that way, of the single-mindedness of Gary Gensler was the speed with which the US got their regulations out following those 2009 commitments, which comes with its pros and certainly comes with its cons. And we'll be discussing during the panel session part of the challenges that comes when you've got different speeds of implementation of essentially the same types of regulation around the globe and the challenges that gives rise to for cross-border recognition for everyone else who's going later at the same process. The path forward statement that we had last July was a helpful reminder and reaffirmation of those G20 commitments and a desire between the US and Europe to work together on areas of common interest and common regulation with mixed success to date. And the clear desire, though, is to monitor systemic risk and to prevent a risk of a repeat of a similar crisis in the future. There are different approaches taken between the US and Europe. With the Dodd-Frank Act, clearly they focused on the swaps industry, whereas in Europe we've focused more broadly, also capturing the listed derivatives industry, and reporting works in a very different way in Europe with two-sided reporting compared to one-sided reporting in the US. With some of the more granular issues, we think about the extension of rules from the US to Europe. Everyone thinks about the US person definition or the exempt DCO regime that is tentatively being proposed by the CFTC on the one hand, and then equally we have the application of certain aspects of EMIR, in particular Article 39 that relates to account segregation, being imposed potentially on US investment banks that are clearing members when they're acting with respect to European clients on European clearing houses. So the extraterritoriality of laws moves both ways, and certainly if you speak to people in Asia, they will say that their view is that Europe is just as guilty, if one uses that word, of cross-border application as the US. So part of the challenge is, as we all move together, looking to implement those G20 commitments, how do we strike the right balance, and how do we make sure that the rules that we're writing that have the common drivers interweave with each other perfectly, and how do we avoid conflict of laws where we're trying to apply more local rules to what is invariably a global industry. With Article 25 of EMIR looking at the recognition of foreign regimes outside of Europe, and that being interlinked with the regulatory capital treatment for members of clearinghouses. There are 5 jurisdictions that Michel Barnier announced a couple of weeks ago will likely be going first and are not that far away from recognition being granted. The US was not on that list, but Michel Barnier was keen to point out that he was confident there would be some degree of resolution, and the outstanding point seems to be a desire on the part of the Europeans for an alignment of the way that the margining rules operate as between the US and Europe. The differences can be as big as 40%. Sometimes if you're looking to margin the same trade, depending on which rule set you're looking at, and it could be the Europeans have got the right approach, it could be the US have got the right approach. The Dodd-Frank requirements for CEF registration are also something that the US are alive to in terms of the impact that might have on some of the MTFs here in Europe. And they've proposed a qualifying MTF regime, which provided that you meet certain tests, then you will be exempt from the CEF registration requirements. At the moment, my understanding is no one has applied for that QMTF status. And indeed that the CFTC are working through some further guidance before they're able to settle on the regime. The other examples are requirements to potentially establish a branch in the European Union if you are conducting business from outside the EU but to European clients. And in particular, under the MiFIR regulation that we're working through at the moment, if you're accessing markets from outside the EU using direct electronic access, then you're not able to rely on the exemptions from MiFIR. The dialogue has been extensive. I don't think there's any problem with a lack of talking. There are plenty of fora where there is dialogue directly between the US and Europe, and indeed more broadly. So one of the things I'll be looking to focus on today is actually the content of those discussions and perhaps where the biggest areas of disagreement still exist. We see one of the challenges is that there's no single body that is responsible for the creation and enforcement of global regulation. There are different schools of thought as to how to address that, which we'll touch on today. We obviously have the G20, the European Commission, IOSCO, BCBS, FSB, and others. But there's no single rule writer and no international referee for disputes where there are differences of approach between the US and Europe and other jurisdictions. We have the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, and round 6 of those discussions is here in Brussels next week. And part of the question is that the right home for financial regulation? The US say no, the Europeans say yes, and we will look to cover some of that in our second session today. So I'll be trying not to touch on TTIP in this first session because that will be part of the focus for the second session later this morning. And the exchange of letters between Michel Barnier and Scott Amalia, the CFTC Commissioner, does show a commonality of desired approach in many ways. Both of them talk about agreement on an outcomes-based approach to regulation. And both of them agree that there should be some deference to one another's rules, provided we can all agree with those rules. The differing views does seem to be on margining and does seem to be on how essentially identical or not the respective rules are as between Europe and the US. So from an industry perspective, I guess what we're really looking for as we move towards 2020 is to have 2020 vision of what it is the US and European and broader regulators and rule writers would like the start of the next decade to look like when it comes to financial regulation, and to understand clearly as we work through implementing each part of the G20 commitments, among others, exactly where any given piece of regulation fits into the jigsaw puzzle that we're creating as we move towards the end of this decade. And I suspect what will happen is as we get towards 2019, 2020, there will be a re-evaluation of where we got to over the course of this decade, and we consider again whether the rules that we've spent this decade creating will continue to be fit for purpose for the 2020s. So this is just part of a natural evolution over time, and part of the questions that gets raised is, in many ways we're trying to fix the challenges of the last crisis. Will those changes that we've brought about do all we need to avoid the next crisis, or indeed will they in some ways build in the next crisis?